Venom Computers. This is Intelligent Performance.
Welcome to Intelligent Performance, where we are fanatical about excellence in human endeavour. And today I'd like you to welcome Chris Robertson, an amateur philosopher, an electrician by day, and an author by night, and by his own admission, a bit of a hobby of yours, but this sounds more like an infatuation, I think, to be fair, Chris, at this stage. I think hobby sounds like something small and insignificant. And when you've written multiple books around the areas of philosophy, and I feel like you're really kind of living out the olden way of having many dimensions to us as personalities, right? So first of all, welcome, Chris. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us.
Well, the pleasure is mutual. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love the word infatuation because it seems to get back to something that was lost in philosophia, right? The supposed love of wisdom that so often in academia becomes this kind of cold clinical thing. And I think it is good to keep the love in it, infatuation, so to speak, but not too close.
That's interesting. It's interesting you pick up on that point. So where I want to start, Chris, actually is with all guests. So this is a podcast on behalf of Venom Computers. They build and create high performance notebook computers, which are used around the world. And their design philosophy is intelligent performance. And so I'm curious, what's your take on intelligent performance? How would you interpret that phrase?
Well, it comes down to how one defines intelligence and what one looks for in an intelligent response. You know, intelligence, when you're talking about IQ, for example, which is a very tricky thing to put your finger on. Is that actually measuring? What is that measuring exactly? Is it just G-score? Is it speed and processing? And does that predict outcomes? Most people, I think, when you get down to it, define intelligence as an ability to adapt, and ideally to adapt quickly to new circumstances. And this has led to some very interesting questions in computing in particular, especially with this explosion in artificial intelligence. Is that intelligent, or is it the mere simulation of the appearance of intelligence? And is there a difference? Is there a difference between the two? I don't normally interact with ChatGPT and these other AI programs too much, except I have discovered it's very useful for asking for code references. You can't trust it because it will lie. It will invent codes that don't exist. But you can ask it where would I look up this code? And there the check is built into the question. But I did have a very long conversation with ChatGPT a few days ago, actually, just as an experiment, because I was I'm not a Christian myself, but I sort of put on my Christian hat and I attempted to convert ChatGPT to Christianity. And I posted the conversation on my blog so people can read that if that's sort of up their alley. If you're into that strange Venn diagram intersection between, technology and theology. There's 5 people who are fanatically into that, and everyone else is like, that's some weird nerd stuff. But, it does push some, there are some people who read that and they were like, oh man, this was giving more intelligent and thoughtful and soulful answers than most humans. Whereas for me, the other participant in this dialogue of sorts, it was really, really interesting right up until it hit this threshold where it suddenly became incredibly painfully uninteresting. And it was the wall where the what's the name of the test? Not the Chinese room test, but the test for an artificial intelligence to simulate the feeling of it interacting with a human. Do you remember the name of that?
Like a simulation? Is that what you mean?
There was a name for a test given by some computer scientist it will occur to all the computer nerds will be screaming this in the comment section. But basically, it suddenly it felt like I was no longer interacting with a believable person. It was impossible to maintain a suspension of disbelief, to borrow literary language.
Right.
And at that point, you suddenly lose all interest. You feel like you're talking to yourself in this very lame and what kind of language do you tolerate on your channel?
Just keep it PG if we can. Or
okay. So I won't use innuendo, but very it felt like self-pleasuring rather than something exploratory,
right.
and like a genuine conversation, like
Interesting.
So is that intelligence there? It's it didn't feel like it to me. But then again, someone might say that when speaking to another human being. So what's your metric becomes a very important question.
Chris, probably one of the more detailed answers, and one which isn't really an answer either. It's more challenging the premise, which I always like a good challenge of the premise, given that this whole podcast is about counterintuitive thinking. And I think we get to better answers when we don't just take the question on face value. So, firstly, thanks for throwing back. I guess it really does come down to how do you define intelligence, which I think it's banded around, right? And I guess that speaks to your area of expertise, which is a really curious one for me. It was one I must say I'm a little bit nervous about, and I say that from a risk of feeling uneducated, I think is the word, or lacking in understanding more broadly. And
if it makes you feel better, I have no 4-year degree, so you're
yeah, okay.
It's fine.
Well, I think I've done a 3-year degree, and I can't really say it's really worth it. So it's not really much these days, I think. But the broader point here, Chris, and I think this is where I was most intrigued by your story, your kind of focus, and your specialism in this space, is that it kind of speaks to an older way of doing things, right? This kind of that philosophy used to be so commonplace, and I was looking at education and learning about the education system prior to what we have right now, where that was all about producing workers for the factories. Prior to that, it was really about kids were schooled on, these kind of ancient texts, the stories, the philosophy was paid great attention to. Parents would force their kids, from what I understand, they get the nanny to train them on these kind of classic titles, right? And the depth of thinking, I'm firmly of the opinion now. I feel like we've got dumber in many ways, Chris. We've got smarter in certain ways. We've got technology is increasing, but if you look at, if you challenge the average American, average Australian, average POM or English person, that is, I doubt they'd have any clue to the depth which might be in these readings. So from a performance perspective, Chris, what are people missing when it comes to these things? And maybe if you could weave in there, like what was your discovery into this space as well? Like, how did you end up in this scenario?
Well, how did I end up here? There's a number of possible points one could start at. I guess I wound up on this path much earlier than most people would have been, perhaps earlier than I should have been. When I was 11, my parents let me go to a sort of philosophy camp at the University of Washington, which was the most fun I had as a kid, even including the soccer and the chess and the martial arts and all this other stuff. So it was extraordinary, and I didn't touch philosophy again until I was in high school. But right. I think that summer primed my thinking in a lot of ways. And then in high school, I, started taking religion very seriously, first in one direction and then in another. But it all comes down to, I think, taking one's life seriously. And my wife will still occasionally make fun of me for this phrase, for saying I didn't want to mislive. And that was my thinking when I was in, a sophomore or junior in high school. and it will take you to some wild places. I think as far as what people get wrong, and this is not original thinking on my part, but we were talking a little bit about intelligence before and what is intelligence. Some people will say that the defining feature of intelligence is speed, that G score, the ability to not just come to the correct conclusion, but to come to conclusions quickly and respond quickly. There's perhaps a degree of truth to that. But I think there's a certain shallowness that inevitably comes along with speed. You take answers and you respond quickly. You get obsessed with doing things quickly and turning around quickly, making money quickly, coming to interesting answers quickly. I think philology, which is another classical art that's been lost largely in recent years, Nietzsche defined as the art of reading slowly. I think one could say philosophy is very similar. It's the art of thinking slowly. And you gain something very important when you slow down your pace and explore things at more depth. I think our tendency to become bored with things in modern society, we need this constant stimulation, is tied to an addiction to this kind of speed. So there might be a problem with our time horizons that we've become acclimated to everything being done faster, chores being done faster, education happening faster. If people slow down and say, no, I'm going to take this seriously enough to take my time, whether that's in what I'm going to choose to do for work or how I'm going to read this book. I'm going to read it page by page rather than trying to learn to speed read so I can get through as many books as quickly as possible. And that's how I will become an educated person. There is, I think, some value in nothing measurable, which is the tricky thing, because everyone's looking for metrics. Everyone's looking for something that's measurable. But there's a je ne sais quoi, a certain something that follows from approaching these sorts of important subjects with care and patience and thoughtfulness rather than trying to do things quickly. And I wonder, as a sort of aside, how different our sort of political culture of outrage would change if everything felt a little bit less urgent,
It's really powerful that I think I've had similar musings around like development, right? It's and we face this in my day job. We train up and coming leaders, and we found increasingly that people are so busy that they don't have the time to read, which is usually the cover story for they see no reason to read or find reading, almost like an inconvenience in some capacity. And what's interesting is those who do, you've then got a small collection of people who try and find the hack, and they seek out the book summary apps, which can translate what it would normally be a 6-hour audiobook into 15 minutes or a 3-minute grab, and it's like,
yes,
I feel like what you're talking to there is about development, right? And maybe it's almost like character. There was a great quote I read recently about the character, is about multiple events happening over a prolonged period, and that's how you form character. And so is almost something which doesn't get spoken about a lot in the mainstream press. But I think when you look at kind of traditional sectors, so if you look at finance, what's interesting about finance is it's evolved significantly, but actually it comes right back to the premise of what's the character of the lender, what's the character of the borrower, right? And how do you esteem them? And character's still like front and center of the whole finance sector. And if the character is in question, basically it doesn't happen. I feel that's kind of what you're talking about, that formation period. We kind of undervalue that. But I wonder if it's, from your perspective, is it that because we have overlooked the knowledge set which philosophy represents? Is it kind of I feel like it's almost got a branding problem. Chris, I'm not sure what your take on that is, whether we misunderstand it, kind of gets branded as historical and these people just walking around in togas and what could they possibly teach us, you know, in our sophisticated blah 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 studios with our fancy microphones, etc. You know, like what could they? How could that possibly relate? I'm not sure what the question is, but I'm curious on your thinking.
It's a very fun question, and it puts me at a bit of a crossroads. I'm feeling very torn because on the one hand, I would agree that philosophy does have a branding problem, and it's a strange kind of multifaceted branding problem, and part of me doesn't want to fix that. Part of me wants to keep philosophy appearing to be something obsolete and uninteresting, because the problem, if philosophy becomes too popular, as it has been popularized in a couple cases. I won't name names here on a pleasant podcast like your own, but there have been some people who have attempted to popularize philosophy by making it more accessible, by basically bringing philosophy, condensing it down into, you know, singular quotes superimposed over images of Greek statues. And what that does is it actually takes the philosophy out of philosophy. If you are just going for the nice pithy takeaway quote, and this is what you should believe, and you're taking away the process, the thinking through, the questioning, the back and forth, the dialogue, the dialectic in the Aristotelian sense, not the Hegelian sense. We can get into that later. It's not actually philosophy anymore. So part of me wants to keep philosophy boring, as it were.
Yeah. So what you're saying, I guess it's kind of, if we break it into a travel analogy, is that with flying, the advent of flying and the popularity of it, we no longer value the journey. We almost see the journey as like an annoying part because it gets in the way of us getting to the destination.
Yeah.
Would that?
There's a exactly. There's a very funny Mark Twain definition, which is that a classic is any book that people want to have read but people don't want to read. Everyone wants to have read War and Peace. No one wants to read War and Peace. Everyone wants to have read Plato's Republic. No one wants to read Plato's Republic. And so that what you end up with is a philosophy culture online of videos summarizing these thinkers, and many of the summaries read listen as summaries done by people who are summarizing other summaries. Like they miss certain phrases and lines, and certain very bad takes, I think, get sort of continue because no one bothers to go back and check the original source material.
So I'm curious, Tim Ferriss kind of popularized Stoicism, right? In terms of, certainly, let me rephrase that.
Man.
It wasn't Tim Ferriss's thing, but he certainly kind of hung his hat on it. I've been sent a TED talk recently about Tim and the power of mapping your fears. Is this kind of an example about what you're referring to without throwing Tim under the bus, Chris? Or
yeah, so I like Tim Ferriss. I don't agree with Tim Ferriss on very many things, but I like him as a person. He might have been the first person to sort of bring Stoicism into the popular domain. The most popular, I said I wasn't going to mention names, but I will since we are mentioning names. The most popular popularizer of Stoicism is a gentleman named Ryan Holiday. He runs like the Daily Stoic in these pages. He's written a number of books. One genuinely interesting one is called Trust Me, I'm Lying, Confessions of a Media Hitman or something to that effect. Trust Me, I'm Lying is the main title. And it talks about his life as a marketer, basically, and a sort of a covert black market media campaign kind of marketer, doing things in sort of a sleazy way. And he wrote this book, partially to make money, I'm sure, but mostly to try to inform people of these techniques. One gets the very clear sense that he was having a bit of a crisis of conscience. to his credit, and he's like, I've been doing this and sort of manipulating people, and I feel kind of gross about it. And so what it looks like he did, I can't read minds. I don't know what's going on inside his head, but what it looks like is that he said, I'm going to take my media manipulation skills and use them for good. I'm going to be Boromir, and I'm going to take the ring of power and use it for good. And he decided, I'm going to use my marketing skills to promote stoicism. What could be wrong with that? I'm going to promote Marcus Aurelius. I'm going to promote Epictetus, Seneca, Zeno, and so forth. And he wrote these books, The Silence is Key, The Obstacle is the Way. There was like one other book I got halfway through of his. There's no philosophy there. It's an amalgamation of quotes, sort of semi-inspirational stories, sort of mashed together into a book with no coherent framework. There's none of the metaphysical beliefs that informed actual Stoicism at the time of Seneca and Epictetus. And I think that's a problem. And again, I like Tim Ferriss a lot, but that's sort of the problem with Tim Ferriss's whole approach to life. I remember reading The 4-Hour Workweek back in high school, and I was just astonished and very intrigued by it. So who can read this as a young man and not be inspired by it? Mm-hmm. But it's that problem with trying to get things quickly, and the way I see work today, because I think this is an interesting and maybe of import to you and your line of work, point of comparison. The way I see it, there are three primary philosophers of work for millennials and Gen Z kids today. There's Tim Ferriss with the 4-Hour Workweek, and that's all about condensing everything to maximize your freedom, to maximize your time. But it's about escaping the matrix of the 9-to-5 grind. It's about escaping this work. The second major philosophy of work comes from, you might have heard of this character, a guy named Andrew Tate. He and with Tate, I listened to the first probably 2/3 of his Hustlers University series, which is just him talking about how to be successful in business. And his first rule, and the thing that informs everything else, is speed. Speed, speed, speed. Time is money. Do everything fast. Do everything fast. Be efficient. And Tate is not trying to maximize freedom, but he's trying to maximize status. For him, the matrix is low class. And so what you are trying to escape, and they both Ferriss and Tate frame it in terms of the matrix, interestingly. Tate a little bit more explicitly. You're trying to escape this constraints of the world and achieve high status or achieve freedom. And there are some pros to that, and there are some perhaps cons to that. But both Ferriss and Tate have had some interesting moments. Ferriss, for people who follow him, suffered some extremely serious depression to the point of suicidal ideation a few years back. I don't know how he's doing recently. I assume he's doing a little bit better, but there was something clearly very unfulfilling in this. And Andrew Tate, we haven't seen that, although he has started, waxing more philosophical and converting to a traditional religion. But there was an interview where a psychiatrist asked Andrew Tate, is there anyone who you are jealous of? Anyone who you envy? And he said, no, there's no one I envy. And then he paused and he said, well, there is one kind of man I envy. And very few men are actually like this. A lot of guys think they're like this, but they're not. But they do exist. And he says, those are the men who genuinely don't care. The men who genuinely aren't interested in the Bugattis and the women. The men who are, in some sense, free from those desires of status. He's like, I'm jealous of those guys. And it was a very profound kind of Alexander the Great meets Diogenes moment. Um, where here's this admittedly great man, this extremely successful person saying, no, it wasn't everything.
Mm.
Which brings me to the third sort of philosopher of work who hasn't tried to escape anything at all. There's no matrix he's trying to escape. And that person is Mike Rowe. Have you heard of Mike Rowe?
Mm-mm.
He's an American television personality, in fact, but he has some classics training. He's an opera singer, among other things. And he ran a show called Dirty Jobs, where his whole role on Discovery Channel was just to go around. He'd work with plumbers, he'd work with shepherds, he worked with city wastewater workers,
Yeah.
all kinds of people doing basic run-of-the-mill ordinary work. He'd work with, and if you listen to his TED Talk, he has this hilarious story where he's working with shepherds, and I can't share it here because the story itself is not totally PG, but it but he here's this guy talking about doing I think I can say this: sheep castration is what he had to do with these shepherds, and he was extremely uncomfortable, and he starts talking about anagnorisis and peripatia. He starts talking about the reversal of fortunes and recognition in classic Greek language, which is not something you'd normally hear from Americans doing this. They're too busy trying to escape the matrix in some other way. And Mike Rowe seems to have again, I can't read his mind. I don't know if he's the happiest man, but the people he was interviewing and talking with seemed to have the best lives, despite not being free like Tim Ferriss or high status like Andrew Tate. So there is a parallel, I think, between the question, what is good in life, Conan the Barbarian notwithstanding, and how to read a book and how to do philosophy. The going through it as quickly as possible, like Andrew Tate, or trying to do the Spark Notes and get the 80% results out of 20% of the work, like Tim Ferriss, will get you places, but it might not be as satisfying. It might not, upon arrival at your final destination, not be quite as satisfying as it looked.
Such a great answer, Chris. Wow. I love the depth of that. I love the assessment of Andrew Tate as a philosopher. And I think few people engage with this stuff with the depth, or perhaps the perspective, I think maybe is what I hear with that, right? Because I think the characters you just mentioned, I've got Mike Rowe up here on the screen. And it's interesting, right? We certainly, even the term dirty jobs, I think, as you say, it's become interesting around the matrix. It's become interesting. It's certainly almost seen like it's not right, almost, or like you're doing it wrong if you're having to do that, right? If you're working really hard, it's almost like, well, you should be working from home, or if you the words escaping me right now, but that's an interesting take. I'm curious. Let's turn this a little bit towards philosophy in the kind of traditional sense, away from our kind of the three which you just highlighted. What do you think people miss, or what are something like? What are people getting wrong about philosophy, perhaps when they first dip into it? If they were to listen to Seneca, as an example, you may be listening to the diaries of Seneca, and you're diving into looking at stoicism. You've read Tim Ferriss hyped it up, and now you become curious. What are people getting perhaps wrong when they first engage with it?
Well, I guess that would depend on the person. I think there is the tragedy of the human. Maybe this isn't a tragedy. I don't know. I'll say the tendency of people who are naturally gifted with language or who acquire a certain degree of skill with language is to appropriate these ideas for your own ends and to grab onto what ideas you can for your for what's immediately beneficial to you. And this is like most of politics, I think. And I think this is what the ancient philosophers sort of decried in what they called the sophists. You know, the teachers of rhetoric, the teachers of the ability of communication and persuasion. And I think, the problem, I think, with how people approach Stoicism in particular, because I think people, name the philosophy that people become, unusually obsessed with, and you have a glimpse into the sort of pathology that drives them, and it's not always the same pathology. But Stoicism in particular, I think Stoicism can be very beneficial as a kind of therapy. I think it's very useful for people to go through a period of Stoicism, much as it might be useful for people to go through a period of what's the phrase? These talk therapy sessions. Yeah. It's a useful phase. As a philosophy, I don't think Stoicism holds up very well on the metaphysics side, because it is informed. And if you read Seneca and Epictetus and not just Marcus Aurelius and be like, oh, this is so inspiring quotes. This guy had this, long suffering patience and kindness and so forth. That's all very well and good. What Seneca and Epictetus were talking about, and Zeno before them, was a sort of singular logic, a logos, a creative force in the universe that governed all things. And in this metaphysical view of the universe, not only does evil not exist, bad does not exist. There's no such thing as bad. It's a very jarring thing, and you can see this kind of work out in a fun kind of mimetic way with like a Jocko Willink. Your squad gets wiped out. Good. There's always a way to turn it, and that perhaps might be a useful psychological tool to have in your head to deal with stress. But is that philosophy? Is that a pursuit of wisdom? One might argue that it is. What is wise is simply what is useful. But you have to ask, useful for what? And am I coming up with a bunch of rationalizations for something I don't want to actually be? Have I presupposed some desirable end goal that I haven't necessarily questioned very well, and which will wind up being far less satisfying on the other side than I thought it would be? So there's I think a metaphysical implausibility to the theory that lies beneath Stoicism, which is, again, not to say that it can't be useful, especially for people who are going through some very, very tough times. But so as far as what people get wrong about philosophy, I think the Stoics, the people who get into philosophy by means of Stoicism, often think that the purpose of philosophy is like therapy, essentially, and a tool for overcoming trauma. Or if you are Ryan Holiday, maybe philosophy is a tool for achieving success, which it can do. But I would question, like, is that really all that philosophy is about? And what kind of success are we talking about? To sort of go back to the philosophy of work question.
So maybe a following question is, well, what from your perspective, what is the point? Like, what should people, what do you find? And does it come back to that question about your own journey in terms of not wanting to Or yeah, I think you said take your life seriously, right? So not wanting to waste your life, not wanting to
Yeah, not
live.
wanting to mislive and to not reach the end of your life and look back on what you did with regret.
Mm.
Um, there's a very tragic case. I'll name another popular figure that you might have heard of. A gentleman named George Soros. Have you heard of this
Mm.
man?
Yeah, certainly.
Popular. Well, I shouldn't say popular. Well-known, famous
Yeah.
financier. What people I think don't know about George Soros is that George Soros didn't really want to be a financier, not most of all, anyways. What he wanted to be more than anything else was a philosopher. Um, he wrote a book many, many years ago called The Alchemy of Finance, which is where he tried to advance this theory of the name is escaping me. I can't remember what his theory is called, but basically, there you can't have any functional model in a system that is reflexivity. That's the word. He was trying to advance this idea of reflexivity, which is that in an environment where the system is self-aware, as in the economy, you can't have any kind of predictive model because as soon as people become aware of the model, they respond and they do something else. They try to anticipate the model and then the system changes. And so what he was advancing is an idea of how you could act within reflexive systems. And this might sound like this is an economist advancing an interesting economic theory for the purpose of financial gain. No, what he was trying to do was create a dialectical synthesis between Hegel's theory and Marx's theory, between Hegel's dialectic of spirit and Marx's dialectic of materialism. He was trying to be a philosopher, and that's what he wanted to do most of all. But he leaned so far into the finance that he never got a chance to. He never fully worked out his aspiration to be a philosopher. He arguably gave that up. And I thought I was alone in reading George Soros in this way until I heard Nassim Taleb say exactly the same thing. It might have been in a conversation with Tim Ferriss. I don't remember.
Mm.
But Nassim Taleb noticed the same thing. And Taleb has been trying to, another financier cum philosopher, who has leaned much harder into the philosophy side because he doesn't want to suffer George Soros's fate in terms of the trajectory of his life.
Interesting. So I'm just trying to get back to the question. What do you find in philosophy?
Right. Well, I guess in philosophy, a number of things. I think. What's that?
Is it purpose? Is it like like meaning almost? Is it which is
Well, it's the
because you're saying like I think your take is success is an interpretation, or you could read philosophy and you could improve your ability to be successful. You could that gives you some tools, right? But what you're saying is that that's a interpretation of the book or of the quote unquote meaning inside. It sounds like you're saying, but that's kind of like it's cheap compared to what's really accessible. So I'm curious I
think what philosophy gives you are two things. First of all, it has to be mentioned. Deep and profound enjoyment. It is tremendously pleasurable to read these great minds and to feel a connection with these great minds. There's nothing better. But second of all, I would say, and maybe more important to some people, is it gives you the tools to escape these matrices of matrices. It gives you the tools to think to think through these sorts of things, to think what do I actually care about? What is most important? What is going to be satisfying? What kind of life do I want to live? also what is true, or at least most clear, what is most predictive, depending on your theory of truth, about more mundane matters. There's nothing like philosophy to be able to give you the skill to look at a headline or a story about a field that you know nothing about and be like, that's not true. And I know it's not true because of the form, the structure of the presentation. Or maybe not true, but I know that's not trustworthy. There's something suspect in the form. And you can spot this in fields that you know nothing about very often, which is can be a very not just fun skill to have, but a very, very useful skill to have for more practical reasons, not being taken advantage of.
Yeah, I can. That's really, really powerful stuff. In terms of for you, Chris, I'm curious from an accessibility perspective. Where do you go? What would be your guidance to someone, given the value which you've been this wonderful, beautifully articulate, one deep communicator that you are? I'm curious, how do you make it accessible to someone who's been stuck in the, want of a better word, like the modern philosophy of speed, who's been drinking the Kool-Aid of everything's, well, if you're not a millionaire, if you're not a millionaire already, then you're obviously doing it wrong, Chris. If you're not a billionaire, well, there's something significantly wrong with you.
How do you convince someone to slow down? Yeah.
And also,
so
where would you start? Where would you start in terms of if you had to make a recommendation, like where a text, your own books, like where do you engage in this and start to bring the right mindset?
Oh man, Heidegger's answer. Martin Heidegger, the famous 20th century philosopher, his suggestion as far as how people should learn philosophy is start anywhere and keep going. Michael Millerman has been trying to bring that back. That's a fun answer. I like that answer a lot. I think if you're trying to learn philosophy and to enjoy the world of philosophy, you're not just trying to gain the tools, but to find that deeply pleasurable connection with these great minds. I think the best way to start is with Plato's Republic. I cannot recommend it highly enough. And you can't just take the sort of Spark Notes version of it. You have to go through the book. And as Michael Screw says, you haven't read the Republic until you've read it like 3 or 4 times.
Right.
Reading it one time through will leave you bewildered, will leave you confused. What on earth did I just read? Did I just hear this guy advocating for communist fascism? No, that's not what's happening, but that it can look like that. It's a very layered exploration where the members of the dialogue, and Socrates is speaking to 2 young men, Adeimantus and Glaucon, and a few others. But in speaking to Adeimantus and Glaucon, he is also speaking to the reader. What he encourages in these 2 young men is also what he is encouraging in the reader, in their initiation into the world of philosophy and into the exploration of these ideas. The thing I like about Millerman's answer, or Heidegger's answer, I suppose, is if you start anywhere and keep going, eventually you will get back to Plato's Republic. All roads lead to Rome in that regard. But if you know that going in, why not start at the fun place? You might not get it all the first time through. In fact, you almost certainly won't. It's extremely complicated text, deceptively complicated text, because it can look very simple on the surface. But in fact, if I could push one thing more than my books, more than anything else, I did an 8-part series with Jack Donovan, where we actually walked through every book of the Republic and talked about it at great length. And is that a complete overview of everything that's going on? No, it's not. But it at least should be a window into the complexity and beauty and perhaps contemporarily relevant subjects going on in this story.
Love that. Really fab. Chris, I'm kind of hasten to bring it to a close, but it's been an absolutely fantastic conversation. One which you've been masterful in helping me navigate a very tricky topic, and one which I'm no doubt the people listening to this are probably, I hope, really starting to relook at or question how the philosophy they may have quote unquote digested and absorbed and live out in a more of a kind of hang on a second, what is, because I feel like we've all got some sort of philosophy, but we don't necessarily know its origin, right? And that maybe that's
yes,
and a lot of people, even spruiking, if you're a follower of Tim Ferriss, again, you don't quite know where that's coming from. So, I feel like it's the time to be introspective about what kind of philosophy do you follow already. Maybe.
Yeah. And to not be afraid of questioning these things. Don't be afraid. Look at these big questions not as a political participant in a team sport, but as an observer who is trying to see these different arguments and possible worldviews, whether that's Tim Ferriss's philosophy of work or Andrew Tate's or George Soros's notion of the economy or whatever. Like, what's the strength in this position? And to not be afraid of the possible consequences or the consequences of criticisms of these views. I think there are very strong criticisms of all three of those characters, and have made some myself. But to enjoy the process, and if you come to learn the process, to think of these things not as life or death urgent struggles that you need to win for your side, you can more thoughtfully explore these questions and have a better chance at coming to the correct, or if not the correct, at least stronger answers, more likely to be more satisfying answers, precisely because they do matter. As paradoxical as that may sound, treating them as though it doesn't matter because it does, and enjoying the process as you go through life.
Not just trying to rush to the end. So
yes,
terrific, Chris. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.